Okay, there. Okay,
Okay.
Ryan is a reader in psychology at Royal Holloway College in London. He's involved in looking at cognitive neuropsychiatry, evolutionary psychology, and behavioural economics. And I believe he's originally from down under. Is that right?
That's right.
We would detect that, I think.
You're a very refined accent.
Yeah. Okay, so we're looking forward to your talk and.
Thanks very much, Hilary. And yeah, just a brief thank you to the organisers here, Hilary and Rachel, and also Duncan for the kind invitation to be here. The talks that we've had so far have been really fabulous, so it's a real privilege to be in such company, although somewhat intimidating. Okay, like Paul, I'm going to be talking a fair bit about delusions. I have gotten a bit carried away with my rhyming scheme in my title here, though I am hoping to touch at least briefly on positive illusions and on the notion of jumping to conclusions. Okay, but I'm just going to kick things off by saying a few words about rational belief formation. On a sort of prominent prevailing view, rational belief formation is properly responsive to evidence. So if you're a rational believer, you hold your beliefs with the degree of firmness that's warranted by the evidence that's available to you. And this idea was captured by David Hume in this pithy, rather sexist statement, "A wise man apportions his beliefs to the evidence." So that's the Humean ideal. This is an idea that's, I guess, been formalised by Thomas Bayes as well, although like Paul, I'm not going to go into Bayes' theorem. So the ideal, this rational ideal, is that you should hold your beliefs with the firmness, with the degree of conviction warranted by the evidence. Mere mortals, however, like all of us here, tend to fall short of this ideal. So most humans are susceptible to what are called positive illusions, which means that we tend to overestimate our positive qualities and our future prospects. For instance, we're susceptible to what's known as the better than average effect. We tend to believe that we're better than the average person on qualities like driving ability, intelligence, and whatnot. Most of us also display unrealistic optimism about our future prospects, including our future health prospects. Meanwhile, some scholars in the cognitive science of religion have argued that humans are oversensitive to cues of intentional agency. And it's been suggested that this tendency is maybe at least partly responsible for the widespread cross-cultural prevalence of supernatural agent concepts. I've got a little bit of a beef with this idea, but don't have much time to go into that at the moment. But in terms of evidence, more radical departures from strict rationality can be observed in a range of different psychiatric and neurological conditions where people may have bizarre delusional beliefs about reality. We've seen a few examples from Paul. Here's just a couple of examples that I'm going to touch on in this talk. Firstly, the idea that someone close to you has been replaced by a physically identical imposter. The idea that you have a swarm of bees buzzing around in your head. Or the idea that the person you see when you look into the mirror is not you, but some stranger that looks like you. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss the relationship of delusional beliefs like these with evidence. And I'm going to try and make a particular argument. I'm going to suggest that the dominant psychiatric conception of delusions has things, in some respects, backwards. So let me come on to this dominant psychiatric conception. Well, it's notoriously difficult to define delusions in a way that scholars can agree upon. This is a very well-known definition from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So according to the DSM, as it's known, a delusion is a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that's firmly sustained despite what everyone else believes and despite obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. Excuse me. So this is a very widely discussed and well-known definition. It's perhaps the most widely used definition in clinical and research settings. But there are a number of problems with this definition. Some people have taken issue with the idea that delusions need to be false beliefs. just as an example, some beliefs that are delusional might be true sort of serendipitously or by accident. For instance, someone who's got delusional jealousy harbours delusional beliefs about the fidelity of their partner. It could turn out, just by coincidence, that their partner is actually being unfaithful, or perhaps the delusions drive their partner into the arms of someone else. The notion that delusions are about external realities being criticised because many delusional beliefs are about internal physical reality. For instance, some people believe that they're pregnant with puppies, or that there's at least one case of someone who believed they had a nuclear reactor inside their body. So there's a range of different problems with this delusion, with this definition rather. In the most recent edition of this Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there's a somewhat revised definition. You can see here there's no more reference to false belief, it's more about fixed belief, no mention of external reality here. But both definitions have something in common. In the move from DSM-4 to DSM-5, there's still the same emphasis on delusions, on the relationship between delusional beliefs and evidence. In both cases, delusional beliefs are thought of as being sustained despite evidence to the contrary, or not amenable to change in the light of evidence. And this is consistent with a venerable psychiatric tradition dating back to Carl Jaspers, for instance, who argued that delusions are incorrigible. So on the basis of this tradition, these current definitions, I think it's fair to say that the dominant psychiatric conception of delusions is that delusions are, or that deluded individuals are insufficiently responsive to evidence. They're under-responsive to evidence, but they don't apportion their beliefs to the evidence in the way that they should. So this is an idea that I'm going to try and put a little bit of pressure on. Okay, so let's come back to a couple of the individual cases that I started out with. So as I mentioned, some people believe that someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter. This is known as Capgras delusions, named after the French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras. So where might this bizarre idea come from, the idea that someone close to you has been replaced by a doppelganger? This is a picture of a psychologist, Brendan Maynard, and he argued that whereas most of us might think of delusions as involving defective reasoning, delusions actually, the pathology in delusions is a pathology in experience. So his argument is basically that if you or I were to have the kind of anomalous experience that deluded individuals have, you would also develop a delusion. So deluded individuals are processing very strange, aberrant experiences with normal reasoning processes. So just to show how this works in the context of Capgras delusion, for instance, which is the imposter delusion, Ellis and Young have suggested that Capgras delusion results when you have damage to neural pathways that underpin the emotional component of face recognition. So the idea is that when you see someone familiar to you, if the door were to open right now and my mother were to walk in the room, I'd be able to sort of pass the visual features of her face and assign her an identity. That's my mum. But there's also another component of face recognition which gives you the little kind of emotional buzz of familiarity that you experience when you see someone you know. So the idea here is that if you have some kind of neurological disconnection between those two components, you may get a discordant experience between how a familiar person looks and the way that they feel. So I've had this, a bump on the head or some kind of brain damage. My mother walks in and I think, well, that looks exactly like my mum, but something feels very strange about this. She doesn't feel like my mum. And you can see in that situation how the idea that she's an imposter might have some appeal. One nice thing about this idea is that it's been put to the empirical test. So there are a few different studies which have shown that patients with Capgras delusion don't show the usual kind of pattern of emotional or autonomic discrimination between familiar and unfamiliar faces. So what's usually done in these studies is that participants are shown a range of unfamiliar faces with some familiar faces interspersed, and their skin conductance response to those faces is measured. Here are the results of some control participants. The red bars show their response to familiar faces, people they know, so you get a larger skin conductance response than to the yellow bar, than to the unfamiliar faces. But Capgras patients don't show this pattern of discrimination, so show familiar and unfamiliar faces elicit a sort of similar degree of autonomic or affective response. Moving on to a different example, this is a historical example. Southard described the case of a woman who thought that she had a hive of bees buzzing around in her head. So you might ask where this bizarre idea would come from. Well, it seems that she may have suffered from tinnitus because she indeed complained of having a noise in her head, a buzzing sound in her head. So the connection here seems quite quite straightforward. She may have had an anomalous buzzing experience, and the delusion that she had bees in her head was a direct response to this buzzing experience. I also mentioned that some people believe the person they see in the mirror is not them, but a stranger. Got a brief
Who
video.
is that?
That's not me.
Who is
Yeah,
it?
it's straight away. I mean, I thought, first of all, I didn't like his face at all. But I got used to his face, and I over smiled whenever we get to the bathroom for washing it. But it's not me.
It's not you.
No.
So this is the person that you see in your house.
Yes.
Okay, and it's not you.
No.
Okay. What does that person look like?
Well, he looks like me.
He does look like you.
Yes, I see it.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yes. He's not a bad looking fella.
Okay, so it's quite a character, this gentleman, but I'm sure you'll all agree that it's quite a bizarre idea to think of the person in the mirror as being someone else. Where would that idea come from? What could suggest a belief with that content? So this is a patient, a colleague of mine, Laura Breen, in Sydney, tested some years ago. So he underwent a range of different neuropsychological tests, and it turned out that he had what's been referred to as mirror agnosia. So we'll call him TH. So this gentleman, he was unable to interact appropriately with mirrors, and it seemed that he had deficient kind of awareness of mirrors' spatial relations. Just to give you an idea, if there's a mirror here, and he was placed in front of the mirror and an object was placed on his shoulder, and he was asked to reach for the object, whereas you or I would use the mirror to navigate our hand back and take the object, he would smack his hand into the mirror or try and reach around behind the mirror. So he seemed to have some kind of deficiency in the ordinary appreciation of mirrored spatial relations. But for TH, a mirror was akin to a hole in the wall or a window. And ordinarily, when we see somebody through a window, that person is not us. So the suggestion is that this anomalous experience of reflected space is what underpinned his delusion that the person he saw was not him but a stranger. Okay, so I've taken this idea of Brendan Mayer, the idea that delusions are essentially normal responses to very unusual perceptual experiences, and I've just illustrated that with a couple of examples. So if an anomalous experience, emotional experience of faces, you might end up with the imposter delusion, Capgras delusion. An anomalous buzzing experience may yield the bees in the head delusion. An anomalous experience of reflected space may yield the idea that the person you see when you look in the mirror is a stranger. So is this a complete explanation of delusions? Is Brendan Mayer right? Is anomalous experience sufficient for a delusion to develop? Well, of course, Brendan Mayer says yes, because his argument is that delusions are simply normal responses to unusual experiences. But we think that there's a problem with this approach because, for one thing, tinnitus, the audiological symptom of having a ringing or buzzing sound in the ears, is not at all rare. There are tens of thousands of people. Actually, there's a recent prevalence study which showed that in the States, for instance, about 30 million people suffer from tinnitus. But of course, the delusion that you have bees in your head is exceedingly rare. There have also been cases of mirror agnosia reported where people can't interact appropriately with mirrors, but where they don't have the delusion that the person they see in the mirror is not them. And as regards Capgras delusion, there are patients who describe a discordance between a familiar person, how a familiar person looks and feels, who are not delusional. So it is I wanted to give a plug to my wife who's turning here. This is an interview with a patient who had temporal lobe surgery for intractable epilepsy. After the operation, the interviewer asked whether she'd noticed any change, and she said, yes, the first thing I noticed was Mum. When she walked in the room, it was cardboard, an image, if that's the right word, like a picture of her, but it wasn't her. Right, so you knew it looked like your mum, and she says, well, you can look different by expression or through feeling or by doing your hair differently or whatever, but it wasn't different in that way. It was of having a different inside of her. I can't sort of explain it, it just didn't feel like her. So this seems like a kind of perfectly tailored description of this idea of the experience that ostensibly underpins the imposter delusion, but this person wasn't actually saying that her mum had been replaced by an imposter. She was just describing an experience here. Okay, so anomalous experience, we would argue, is not sufficient. It may be necessary, but not sufficient for a delusion to develop. So together with some of my colleagues, primarily Max Coltart, who Paul mentioned beforehand, we've developed this, over some years now, we've been talking about a two-factor theory of delusions. And the idea is that any delusion requires the conjunction of not one but two different factors. The first factor being an anomalous experience of some kind, which furnishes the content of the delusional belief. So if it's an anomalous experience of a buzzing sound in your head, you might, the content of the belief might be that bees are in your head. but this needs to be coupled with a second factor which accounts for why this idea is adopted and maintained despite its wild implausibility. And the necessity of the second factor is because there are people, as we've seen, who have, or seem to have the first factor, the anomalous experience, but who don't get the delusion. So we need something extra. But can we say anything more precise about the second factor? It's all very well to say we need a second factor, but that's, in some respects, a kind of contentless suggestion. We're just saying, well, there's some second factor that we need. What could that second factor consist in? Well, let's come back to our dominant psychiatric conception of delusions. So the American Psychiatric Association, as reflected in the DSM manuals and dating back to luminous figures like Carl Jaspers, have argued that deluded individuals are under-responsive to evidence. So perhaps this will help us to explain what's going on here. Maybe the second factor is some kind of insufficient responsiveness to evidence. So if we think of, this is a very crude idea here, if we think of responsiveness to evidence as existing on a kind of continuum, where at one end you've got people who are under-responsive to evidence, and at the other end you're overly responsive to evidence, perhaps too gullible, too willing to accept any evidence that comes your way, with the kind of Humean ideal in the middle there, then people who are unresponsive to evidence will tend to stick to their existing beliefs, to stick to their priors. They're not going to want to take on board new evidence. But on the other hand, at this end of the continuum, you'll tend to underweight your existing beliefs and be overly willing to accommodate your beliefs to new evidence. So according to the DSM, delusions are fixed beliefs not amenable to change in the light of evidence. That's actually the new definition in the DSM-5. It's very clear that seems to be suggesting that delusions are under-responsive to evidence. But is this the case? Are deluded individuals under-responsive to evidence? Let's come back to the cases we've visited so far. In all of these cases, the most salient evidence is an anomalous experience of some kind. So in Capgras delusion, an anomalous emotional experience of faces, a discordance between the way someone feels and the way that they look. There's an anomalous buzzing experience in the bees case, and an anomalous experience of reflected space in the mirror delusion case. So they don't seem like cases where belief formation is under-responsive to evidence, as per this dominant psychiatric conception. On the contrary, these seem like cases where individuals are, if anything, over-responsive to relevant evidence and underweight considerations of general plausibility. So in all of these cases, these beliefs are kind of wildly at variance with ordinary ideas about how the world works. Most of us would never entertain for more than a few seconds the idea that we have bees inside our head if we heard a buzzing sound. But in each case, the belief in question matches the evidence very nicely. For instance, the idea that your partner's been replaced by an imposter, although it's wildly implausible, it may match the idea or the evidence that you've got someone who looks like your partner but doesn't feel like them. Similarly, the idea that you have bees in your head matches the idea of a constant buzzing sound in your head. So constant buzzing sounds just what you might expect if this belief were true. The idea that the person in the mirror is a stranger matches the evidence of a person in a different part of space to me. Okay, so whereas the dominant psychiatric conception is that delusions are fixed beliefs, non-amenable to change, so under-responsive to evidence, I want to argue somewhat provocatively that maybe the opposite is true, that delusions actually involve a tendency to be over-responsive to current sensory evidence. And this suggestion ties in nicely with a classic behavioural finding from experimental psychopathology. In a classic study, Huck and colleagues had 2 jars of beads. In one jar, sorry, this is a black and white picture, but let's imagine that these are, say, red and yellow beads. What they did is that they had 2 jars of beads. One of the jars had 85 red beads and 15 yellow beads, and the other had 85 yellow and 15 red. They hid these jars from view and then drew a series of beads out of one of the jars, and participants had to stop the experiment to when they were ready to decide which of the 2 jars the beads were coming out of. And what they found is that relative to healthy control participants, patients with delusions required fewer draws before making a decision, and nearly half of them decided on the basis of just a single draw. So one red bead would come out, and half of the patients with delusions said, okay, I'm ready to decide right now, it's the mostly red jar. So this finding's been referred to as the jumping conclusions finding. It's a robust and widely replicated effect. It's seen as an important idea. Okay, right. 2 minutes, you said. Okay, so the idea that this tendency to form unwarranted conclusions on the basis of scant evidence is thought to be a core component of delusion formation, and it's consistent with a tendency to overweight current evidence because the hypothesis that someone's drawing from the mostly red jar matches the evidence of a red bead. So if you disregard considerations of prior probability and whatnot and only go with what the evidence is, you see this red bead, if you overweight evidence and over-respond to evidence, then you don't need anything else, you might immediately go for the red jar. Okay, there are some, I was going to tell you a little bit about some some of my empirical work on this recently. I'll skip over that and I'll just briefly mention that I think the idea that delusions involve a tendency to be over-responsive to evidence is also consistent with some of Paul's ideas about aberrant prediction error processing. So tying what he said earlier about prediction error together with this two-factor idea, so it may be that in factor one you have some kind of brain damage or disruption causes anomalous experiences which triggers prediction error signals. Something is wrong, you have a surprise, a mismatch between your expectations and your current experiences. So you've got these prediction error signals. But factor two is that if you have an excess of prediction error signal, or perhaps if you overestimate the precision of the prediction error signal that's been generated, then you may attach too much salience to these anomalous experience, and your belief updating may be biased towards accommodating these experiences. So you over-respond to the experiences, you disregard considerations of general plausibility, and you adopt beliefs that match the experiences even if they're at variance with generally accepted reality. So just recapping, delusional beliefs may nicely match anomalous experiences, but they're highly implausible. So if you're a rational individual, I use this word advisedly in the commas, you'll reject these hypotheses in spite of their intuitive appeal. If you have factor two, however, you may be overly responsive to current evidence, perhaps because of a dysfunctional surge of prediction error or a misestimation of the precision of the prediction error signal, and you may adopt beliefs that match the evidence, even where those beliefs are wildly implausible. Putting it together schematically, factor one, if you have tinnitus and you have an anomalous buzzing experience, if that's coupled with a tendency to overweight the evidence that you have, you may end up with the delusion that you have a swarm of bees buzzing around in your head. And I'll leave it there. I wanted to acknowledge some of my colleagues. Thanks again for having me and thanks for listening.
Ryan, I want to